So thank you for coming. You know, I was at a lecture yesterday. Somebody said this is not church or synagogue. If anybody wants to move up to the front, you're very welcome. You're welcome if you want. Okay, feel free. So I'm going to be. You ready? Okay. So today we are fortunate to have a brilliant younger scholar, Alon Segev, who's here. He teaches continental philosophy at the University of Illinois. He received his doctorate degree from Haifa University in Israel, which was followed by numerous grants, fellowships and grants, teaching positions, including the Lady Davis grant, which I had a couple of decades ago at the Hebrew University. He was a postdoc at the Hebrew University from 2002 to 2003. He was the Max Planck Menerev grant and teaching and research position at Heidelberg University. He was there from 2003 to 2008, and he was a visiting professor at Stanford and at Pittsburgh University. Alon Segev has published extensively on various topics, including ancient and modern philosophy. He's presented papers literally around the United States and internationally. His recent book, which is how I found out about Alon, is Thinking and Killing, Philosophical Discourse in the Shadow of the Third Reich, which was published by De Grunter in Berlin and in New York in 2013. And it was selected by Knowledge Unlatched for its pilot package of books. And it's also available as an ebook. The book deals with the contributions of 8 German thinkers to the Holocaust and the later discussion it provoked. It contains translations of 2 important texts by Carl Schmitt and Ernst Junger, which were previously unknown to the English language. And I'll just say what's crucial about this issue. I think we often have the assumption that the university and scholarship and the educated are somehow the remedy to issues of antisemitism and racism and inequality. But if we look critically at how knowledge is produced and who produces it, we can see that often, unfortunately, the fact is that the university and our thinkers that our societies produce are actually at the forefront at times to unpleasant and even barbaric actions. So I think this is a very important sort of looking at the underpinnings, the philosophical and even civilizational underpinnings to anti-Semitism and various forms of racism. Alon is currently researching the ideological background to the student movement in Germany, particularly as it concerns the Holocaust and contemporary attitudes to Israel. He gave a seminar on this topic to the advanced students of Hebrew University. He has a new book in preparation on the political readings of Descartes in the 20th century. Today's topic, Theodor Lessings, Jewish self-hatred, is the topic. In 1931, Theodor Lessings visited Palestine and was amazed that he could find a copy of his book, The Jewish Self-Hatred, which was sold in Jerusalem, and that he was recognized while visiting the Western Wall. Among the admiring readers of Lessings' book was Gershon Scholem and Max Brod, 2 important Jewish thinkers from Germany. Today his work is completely forgotten, and Lessing would not be recognized by anyone at the Wall these days. Lessing coined and introduced into the discourse on anti-Semitism the term Jewish self-hatred. His book on the topic marked his personal turn from self-hatred to Zionism. And unfortunately, perhaps, it's a timely issue. So, Alon, thank you for being here, and we welcome you to our seminar.
Yes, good evening, and thank you, Charles, for the invitation. And it's a great honor for me to be here and for organizing this wonderful event. And I also wanted to thank Marion for all the organization, and thank you for coming. Yes, so Theodor Lessings, as Charles said, he introduced into the into the political and historical discourse the term Jewish self-hatred. He wrote a book about that. It was very popular among Zionists and then completely forgotten. Sorry? Back in 1931, when Theodor Lessings visited Palestine and was amazed that he could find a copy of his book, Jewish Self-Hatred, sold in Jerusalem, and that he was recognized and called by name by strangers while visiting the Wailing Wall. Among the admiring readers of Lessings' book were Gershom Scholem and Max Brod. Today his book is completely forgotten, and Lessings would definitely not be recognized by anyone at the wall. Lessings coined and introduced into the discourse on anti-Semitism the term Jewish self-hatred. His book on the topic marked his personal turn from self-hatred to Zionism. In this book, Lessings analyzed the phenomenon he tagged Jewish self-hatred and offered a cure. His method was psychoanalysis, and his attitude towards the Jewish question was Nietzschean. The present paper starts with critically analyzing Lessings' text, showing his debt to Nietzsche, Freud, and Husserl. It concludes with Lessings' discussion of Maximilian Harden, a converted Jew in whom Lessings saw an illustrative example of self-hating Jew. The term Jewish self-hatred was coined and introduced into academic and political discourse by Theodor Lessings in 1930. Although, as has been demonstrated by Sander Gilman, we can relate the term back many centuries to expressions and writing by converted Jews regarding non-converted Jews. Jewish self-hater long ago became a label attached by Jews of one political stance to Jews of other political stand. Thus, for example, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called Rami Emanuel and David Axelrod self-hatred Jews. In recent decades, the question of Jewish self-hatred was very often being raised and discussed following suggestion and accusation made by Jews in Israel and abroad that Israel is responsible for at least part of the Palestinian suffering and misery. Lately, the question of Jewish self-hatred has been often raised in relation to the BDS movement, which draws support from Israelis and Jews abroad. The distinction between self-critique and self-hatred seems to be unproblematic and clear on the level of the common sense. But once we try to tackle it on a higher level, we find it difficult to draw clear lines distinguishing self-critique, self-hatred, Jewish self-hatred, and anti-Semitism. Descending from that higher level, we see the peril in automatically dubbing any criticism leveled at Israel's politic as an expression of self-hatred. Most important, as can be inferred from Shulamit Volkov's description of Theodor Lessings' negative attitude toward the Ostjuden, not all expression of Jewish self-hatred by Jews implies self-hatred. A Jewish person does not have to identify himself with the Jewish people or nation. Thus, in hating Jews, he does not necessarily hate himself. The criticism, quotation by Shulamit Volkov, the criticism of Eastern European Jewry by people like Lessings was not self-hatred in this milieu. It was a critique from the outside, from a position of aloofness and distance. Quote ends. The meaning of a given term is contingent upon coherent use and implementation in a circumscribed context. The difficulties implicit in the term Jewish self-hatred emerge once we attempt to implement it. For example, Rachel Farnhagen, Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of the social milieu and literary salon, culture into which she apparently fit, but deep inside she felt her Jewish origin barred her from belonging there. Otto Weininger's Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of his theory, which portrays the Jews as feminine and lacking a personal center. For Weininger, women also lacked such a personal center, but contrary to the Jew, they could find it in their husbands. Likewise, Karl Marx's Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of the critique of capitalism, according to which, as he developed on the Jewish question, Judaism is the idea of capitalism and egoism, an idea that reached its full realization under Christians and within Christian state. Quite differently, Karl Kraus and Anton Kuh, Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of the Zionist movement that began in the late 19th century. Sander Gilman, in his broad study, Jewish self-hatred, which focused on anti-Semitism and Jewish self-hatred in German-speaking zones in Europe from the 12th century to the period after the Holocaust, suggested language as a key to understanding Jewish self-hatred. Thus, any occurrence of anti-Semitism and Jewish self-hatred should be traced back to the peculiar language spoken by Jews or to the relation between different spoken language or jargons. Hebrew is conceived as a secret language of witchery and corruption that molds and forms the personality of the Jew, and then Yiddish is conceived as an inferior German dialect spoken by inferior humans. Hence, both were also apt to serve thieves as means to surreptitiously communicate. Gilman's framework may enable us to map different expressions of anti-Judaism voiced by Jews, but the ambition to trace all this expression to language or to the relation between different languages turned out to be an unjustified theoretical projection, and thus the outcome may look far-fetched. Rachel Farnhagen talked about the sham, of being a Jew as the core of her resentment toward herself. Likewise, Yaakov Wasserman talks about shame as the essence of his Jewish self-hatred. Notice that Farnhagen was born into an Orthodox family, and Yiddish was her first language, whereas Wasserman was born into an entirely assimilated family, and German was his first language. Their shame consisted of various components and cannot be explained away by reducing it to language. Moreover, in the case of Fritz Mautner, who was probably best known today for his contribution to the philosophy of language and his influence on Ludwig Wittgenstein and Samuel Beckett's attitude toward language, Gilman's attempt to trace back the Jewish otherness to spatial Jewish use of language seems to me to be unfounded. The materialistic aspect of language, so Mautner in his memoir, is an essential fact about language as such and not of any specific language. Mautner, who grew up with Czech, German, Hebrew, and Mauscheldeutsch, namely Yiddish, wondered about the contamination of language, namely the use of foreign words and formation of words in one language according to the usage in a different language, but at first with no direct reference to his being a Jew and to the Jews as speaking a peculiar language. Language turns out to be too broad a framework to subsume under different corporeal manifestations such as skin or hair color, differences in custom, and economic status, to name only a few factors to which Gilman refers. Secondly, the juxtaposition of German and a keen and yet different language of the Jews, namely Yiddish, did not exist everywhere. Likewise, because of Jewish resettlement in Palestine and later in the State of Israel, Hebrew was no longer an exotic dead language of prayer only, but also an official spoken language in Israel. In what follows, I will discuss some aspect in Theodor Lessings' studies of Jewish self-hatred. My discussion belongs in the broader discipline term Begriffsgeschichte, namely the history of using a term. I have no pretension providing answers to the questions of how to distinguish between self-hatred, self-critique, Jewish self-hatred, and anti-Semitism. I also do not suggest that the term Jewish self-hatred refers to essentially related phenomena, as Gilman does in claiming that the various phenomena which he classifies as expression of Jewish self-hatred are inherently related by language or relation between languages. I will suggest that we must consider Lessings' recurring reference above all to Nietzsche's philosophy of amor fati, and then to Freud's psychoanalysis and Husserl phenomenology in order to understand the tenor of his theory. Paul Reiter would dedicate a volume to Lessings and Kuh's use of and reference to Jewish self-hatred, classifies Lessings' book Jewish Self-Hatred as a self-help book. It seems to me that this attitude toward the text is possible only by overlooking Lessings' references to Nietzsche and Husserl, and thus yields a deficient and superficial interpretation of Lessings' text. The scope of the present paper allows me to only to point at Lessings' debt to Husserl and Nietzsche, but not to expand on that topic. The question of Jewish self-hatred has been discussed intensively in the last few decades. The context of this discussion is above all the ongoing Palestinian-Israeli conflict. People with Jewish ancestry, Israeli and non-Israeli, who criticize Israel and blame her for the war and the misery of the Palestinians are often tagged as being self-hating Jews. Calls for boycotts of Israel for her policies outside the 1967 borders voiced by Israelis and Jews supporting BDS movement have fueled such discussions. The use of the term self-hating Jew is not new and not confined to discussion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Theodor Herzl referred to Zionists who opposed or did not see the necessity of founding the Jewish state as disguised anti-Semites of Jewish origin. The term also surfaced in the debate between assimilated Jews and Zionists in Europe, each accusing the other of self-hatred. The question concerning Jewish self-hatred and its motives is intimately related to the question of anti-Semitism and its motives, with the difference in the latter case, the agent of hatred is a non-Jew, and in the former case, it is a Jew who has internalized the negative judgments of an anti-Semitic environment. Both judgments, those made by non-Jews and directed against Jews, and those made by Jews directed towards themselves or other Jews, are rooted in abstraction of both the hater and the hated. The subject and the object of these negative judgments lack individuality and serve as specimens of abstract general groups of people, the haters and the hated. Thus, I do not hate the individual person, but rather the Jewish person in him. In this statement, the individual person evaporates and vanishes in the general predicate, Jewish. Thus, following the publication of Hannah Arendt's Eichmann in Jerusalem, Gershom Scholem wrote her a letter in which he accused her of lacking Ahavat Israel, love of Israel or the Jewish people. Arendt's reply was that she had neither love nor lack of love towards this or that people, but rather towards individual, that is, individual people, friends and enemies. Arendt's response bears truth as far as love and hatred go, for such sentiments primarily refer to the relation between individual and only secondarily or metaphorically to relation between groups. What makes apparently Jewish self-hatred hard to grasp is the internalization of the generalization of the hated Jew, that is, projection of the hatred upon oneself. That is to say, the hated person internalizes a general idea or image of Jew which the particular person hates. Thus, Jewish self-hatred implies a problematic assumption that all self-hating Jews have nearly the same self-image which they hate. The particular self-hatred of whatever kind it may be, such as self-underestimation and self-critique, in this framework are all reduced to one hated self-image. It is evident that Lessing lays down this assumption in his study as true, despite its obvious problematic. Quotation from Lessing: "There is no person of Jewish origin, namely Blut, race, in whom we could not find at least signs of Jewish self-hatred." Quote ends. Traditionally, we find three general motives founding Jews' hatred or anti-Semitism: metaphysical, racial, and economic. The metaphysical motive implies a religious worldview in which the Jews are the Messiah's murderer, the obstacle on the way to salvation, not acknowledging the message of Christ or Muhammad, cursed by birth, rootless, and nationless. On the other hand, the racial and economic motives imply a secular worldview. From the racial perspective, the Jew is seen as belonging to an inferior race which threatens the existence of a superior race. From the economic perspective, the Jew is seen as owning money, not sharing in productive activity, living on the back of other people, exploiting the worker, etc. Theodor Lessing, 1872-1933, was born into a middle-class assimilated Jew family in Hanover. He studied medicine and then switched to philosophy, psychology, and literature. By that time, he had converted to Christianity and, as he later admitted, had himself become a self-hating Jew. As Shulamit Volkov tells us, quotation, in 1909, Lessing published a series of articles in the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums entitled Impressions from Galicia and containing an appalling account of Jewish life in this province. Despite his preference for life over intellect, Lessing was shocked at what he saw. In a synagogue in a small town, he suddenly found himself amidst loud crying, mad gestures, general excitement, and restlessness. I was practically shaking with fear at this prayer, he recounted. I got sick, I forced my way out and fled away. Lessing's articles provoked sharp criticism. His unabashed nausea at the sight of his brethren was shocking even for some of the regular, often similarly disposed reader of the Allgemeine Zeitung des Judentums. Nevertheless, they were published in full in this respectable journal and were apparently not entirely unacceptable to the Jewish readership at that time. Quote ends. Following an anti-Semitic incident he experienced in the school where he taught, he returned to Judaism and became an ardent Zionist and even visited Palestine in 1931. In 1925, he published a critical study of Hindenburg, dealing with his weak personality and warning that such weakness of character could open the door to radical forces seeking to ascend to power. Such claims against Hindenburg aroused waves of resent toward and protest against Lessing. His lectures at the university were interrupted by students, and in the end, he was no longer allowed to teach. After the Nazis came to power, Lessing and his wife fled to Czechoslovakia, where he continued to publish in German magazines. Shortly after that, he a reward was offered to anyone who would deliver Lessing into the hands of the Nazis. In August 1933, he was assassinated in his home in Czechoslovakia and died at the age of 61. Lessing's works include studies of Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, and Hindenburg, and on the noise, Lehr. The most obvious influences on his writing and methods are Nietzsche's teaching of amor fati, Freud's psychoanalysis, and Husserl's phenomenology. His book, Jewish Self-Hatred, contained a long introductory essays in which Lessing professed to account for the Jewish self-hatred and to provide a cure. Lessing then explicates his understanding of Jewish self-hatred, applying it to the biographies of 6 prominent German Jews who denied their Jewish roots in their striving to succeed and ascend in the society. Paul Reh, philosopher and physician, a close friend of Nietzsche. Otto Weininger, the author of the most influential book, Sex and Character. Arthur Trebitsch, writer, philosopher, and an ardent anti-Semite. Max Steiner, scientist and intellectual. Walter Calais, German poet. And Maximilian Harden, a prominent journalist, a close friend of Bismarck, and the editor of the journal Die Zukunft. Reading Lessing's treatise on Jewish self-hatred, we should bear in mind that following Nietzsche, Freud, and Husserl, Lessing rejects any realistic, objective, and metaphysical ascription of meaning. That is to say, meaning stems neither from objective reality nor from any metaphysical realm. Reality as such lacks any meaning and is thus indifferent to human beings. Meaning is rather a subjective projection on a naked reality. Thus, Jewish self-hatred, as well as anti-Semitism, can be understood neither metaphysically nor economically nor rationally. Self-hatred is rather a subjective projection. Self-hatred was first systematically explicated by Freud in his Mourning and Melancholy. The question will then be about the cause of such neurosis, neurotic self-hatred. And further, we should ask what steps should be taken according to Lessing to heal this neurosis. Lessing's attitude toward assimilated and self-hating Jews was very negative. By contrast, his attitude towards the Jews living in Palestine and striving to build their own nation was always very positive. Quotation: "Disgrace on all sons who, in order to have the worldly luxury of Western cosmopolitan cities, prefer to dedicate themselves to literature or to pursue an academic career, instead of carrying stones on the road to Jerusalem." Quote ends. This produces the impression that Lessing has an answer to the questions of the cause of neurotic self-hatred and can offer a cure. This impression will turn out to be misleading. Lessing starts his discussion of self-hatred by focusing on the feeling of guilt. Reality is, according to Lessing, bereft of objective meaning. Meaning stem from rather a subjective projection carried out by the individual upon reality. Bad things that befall me have as such no meaning, neither destiny nor intention to afflict me. They rather gain their meaning through my subjective projection of meaning upon reality. I project or ascribe guilt or fault to something or somebody else, and thus I give them meaning and account for their occurrence. I, for example, explain my suffering by ascribing it to other people to whom I attribute the source of my suffering and cause of my grief. It is also possible that I may project guilt or fault upon myself. It is my own fault that something bad has befallen me. Also, one's human nature mainly tends to blame others for bad things that befall oneself. With Jews, Lessing claims, however, it is different. The Jews, following 2 millennia of persecution and suffering, always project guilt upon themselves. We suffer, are tortured, and killed because we are guilty and thus deserve it. Self-hatred relates back to the Jewish Christian practice of confession, vidui, and thus reflects a universal phenomenon. And yet, Lessing claims the Jews exemplify this phenomenon more than any other people on the earth. From the projection of guilt, Lessing continues to a deeper level that triggers the projection of guilt. Lessing utilizes psychoanalysis in order to penetrate behind the projection of guilt. The projection of guilt takes place on the highest part of the personality, on the level of the superego. The superego is a late differentiation between my own ego and the alter ego. This stage of sublimation emanates from the prime level of the ego, in which there is no sublimation and no differentiation between my own ego and the alter ego. Self-hatred is founded in this differentiation, and it turns against its source on the prime level of the ego, the level on which there is not yet differentiation between ego and alter ego. The first and lower level can be retrieved in experience of art and religion. Lessing calls this retrieval religious aesthetical experience. On the higher level on which the differentiation appears, Lessing identifies two kinds of experience: logical experience and moral experience. The higher level, the sublimation, runs counter and strives to annihilate the lower level. With Jews, moral experience and logical perceptual experience, both constitute the upper level of his personality, are not equal, but rather moral experience overweights logical perceptual experience. This is a lot of a minority living among hostile majority, and the minority's need to continuously adapt itself to its surroundings, to look around and ensure that the minority are not conspicuous and are acceptable in the eyes of the majority. The Jew's excessive sublimation can always produce a perfect imitation of the non-Jew, of the hateful surrounding majority. Thus, a Jew can emulate and excel in the surrounding society. But the more the Jew succeeds, the more he adopts and internalizes the viewpoint and norms of his hater, and the better the deception is, the more he is afflicted by self-hatred, and the more his personality demands he take revenge on himself. Assuming that the source of meaning can neither be metaphysical nor economical, the cure of the Jewish self-hatred can be found neither in readaptation of the Jewish religion and rights to the surrounding, nor in changing the economical or social status of the Jew and emancipating him. The solution ought rather to be of psychological kind and lies in affirming life, in affirming one's own destiny, be it the hardest life to live. Lessing writes, quotation, "Don't deceive your destiny, love your destiny, follow your destiny, and follow it to death. Take heart, through all the hells of our human self, you always come into the heaven of yourself, to your eternal people." Quote ends. Affirming one's life and destiny is the only way to bestow meaning on life, to live it fully, and thus to overcome the self-hatred disease. Lessing writes, quotation, "If we were asked, namely we, the Jews, why you thus still want to continue to exist, then if we were honest, we could not reply otherwise than because we exist." Quote ends. This is by no means a self-help language, as Paul Reiter claims, but rather a Nietzschean language. Lessing echoes here Zarathustra called to the cripples and the invalids to affirm their miserable life. Contrary to Christ, who came to heal and redeem from life's misery, Zarathustra came to call people to affirm their life, be it the most miserable and wretched life. Quotation, "When one takes his hump from the hunchback, then does one take from him his spirit? So do the people teach. And when one gives the blind man eyes, then does he see too many bad things on the earth, so that he curse him who healed him. He, however, who makes the lame man run, inflicts upon him the greatest injury. To redeem what is past, and to transform every it was into thus would I have it, that only do I call redemption." Quote ends. Affirmation of life is achieved by a free decision and schluss that should not be derived from any interest or different motive other than to live one's destiny. At this point, we can clearly see part of the problematic of Lessing's theory surface. As he holds, reality in itself has no meaning. Thus it follows that destiny as such, which Lessing calls upon us to submit to, is likewise bereft of meaning. It is rather our subjective projection of the self-hatred. Accordingly, the solution to the problem should have been sought through by means of psychological introspection into the sick soul. Lessing, however, sends us outside to the transcendental destiny to search for the cure. It seems to me that Lessing must have run into this obvious contradiction because he did not tell us where meaning stems from. As we said, meaning is, according to Lessing, a subjective projection onto a bare but meaningless reality. But where does this meaning come from? As we saw, also the lower level of the self, according to Lessing, the id, is a bare reality with no differentiation between subject and object, between me and you. Thus, also the source of the self lacks any meaning. Hence, also the self must get meaning from outside itself. Thus, in the end of the long, complicated intellectual journey to which Lessing took us, we are left with no explanation to the origin of the self-hatred, and likewise with no cure. Of all the 6 biographies of German Jewish intellectuals in Lessing's book who were haunted by self-hatred, I find the last one of Maximilian Harden the most interesting. It is also the most detailed one. Lessing himself was friendly with Harden and thus had more access to his biography. Maximilian Harden was born in 1861 as Felix Ernst Witkowski in Switzerland. Harden was born to a Jewish father who was a silk handler. His brother was an influential banker and politician, Richard Witting. When he was 12 years old, Harden's father forced him to leave the French gymnasium in Berlin. At the age of 13, in 1874, he completed training as theatrical actor and joined a wandering theater group, leaving no clue to his family of his whereabouts. He changed his name to Maximilian Harden and converted to Protestantism. Beginning in 1884, he worked as a theater critic and published under the pseudonym Apostata. He was co-founder of the Free Stage Association and reorganized the German theater in Berlin. In 1892, he founded the magazine Die Zukunft, in which he published art and political critiques. He became friends with Bismarck and directed most of his sharp critique against Bismarck's successor, William II, exposing homosexuality among his advisors in order to discredit his reign. This publication caused great damage to the reigning house and led to lawsuits and proceedings against Maximilian Harden. More important for our purpose, Harden published in Die Zukunft anti-Semitic articles, the most famous of which is Rathenau's anti-Semitic article, Höre Israel, Shema Israel. Rathenau was himself a Jew and later the foreign minister of the Weimar Republic. In this article, in which he admitted that he was himself a Jew, Rathenau wrote regarding the Jews, quotation, "Strange sight, within German life an isolated foreign humankind, glaring and ostensibly dressed with nimble hot-blooded conduct, on the scent of Mark Brandenburg, an Asian mob." Quote ends. Goebbels' völkischer Beobachter and Streicher's Stürmer always returned to this statement made by the Jewish Rathenau whenever they wanted to portray a distorted picture of the Jew as it stems from a Jewish pen. In 1920, the friendship between Rathenau and Harden broke down. Harden began criticizing Rathenau in Die Zukunft. He continued criticizing Rathenau even after his assassination, wondering why his death still drew so much attention. Thus, for example, he wrote concerning Rathenau, quotation, "Cagliostro, bright, witty prototype of the Jewish upper class, however, entirely sterile, no single lasting achievement, and his writings, overmores, will be forgotten, being already today outdated." Quote ends. Judaism, according to Rathenau, was reminiscent of meaningless old Oriental rites in the middle of a modern Western culture. Thus, the Jew should give up this practice in order to remove the tension between themselves and their surroundings. Rathenau's attitude, Lessings says, characterized the mindset of the Jewish majority. It would win, Lessings says, and lead to dissolution of the entire Jewish religion in Germany unless Zionism became so influential and attracted to itself the young generation. On the first anniversary of Die Zukunft, Harden wrote to his 100,000 readers, promising that throughout his entire life he would serve, in accordance with his best capacity and knowledge, the well-being of the German people. Then he turned to talk about the Jews and the Jewish questions. Quotation, "What do you really want?" he said to the Jews. "Do say it clearly. Whose business are you promoting? The business of Germany or Zion?" Quote ends. In the beginning of World War I, Harden voiced in Die Zukunft an enthusiastic support of the war and annexation. When the war was lost, he changed his mind and talked against it. From about 1916, Harden wrote in favor of peace and about rescuing Germany. After the war, he was among the very few Germans who supported the Treaty of Versailles. Then came the revolution, and 2 months after the Treaty of Versailles had been signed, Rathenau was assassinated. A few days after the assassination of Rathenau, an attempt was made to murder Harden, in which he was severely injured. As Lessing concluded, many saw in this attempted murder an appropriate act befitting faithful servants of the fatherland. In the end, it turned out that Harden had always been a foreigner in his land. His assassinators were exculpated, for they were, according to the court, acting out of the conviction that they were getting rid of vermin. Everything was done, according to Lessing, to depict the murderous act as stemming from noble intentions. In the publication of the time, Harden was referred to as Isidor Witkowski from Galicia, who was brought in by Bismarck as a writing assistant. Harden was never called Isidor, and he never came to Germany from Galicia. Although abroad, Harden was accounted as a German fanatic, in Germany he was now referred to as a dirty Jew. The judge in this trial was a converted Jew, a son of a rabbi, and the two lawyers who represented and defended the claim that his murderers had acted out of noble motivation were both converted Jews, Bloch and Schiff. Regarding this, Lessings says, quotation, "A German court in which converted Jews sit favors the murderers of another converted Jew because these murderers ascertain that they wanted to murder in the name and out of the spirit of the German state of mind." Quote ends. Maximilian Harden thus found himself in a strange situation in which he stood as a Jew, trying to defend himself in trial conducted by a converted judge and against two converted lawyers who represented and defended his would-be murderers. And thus, in addressing the court, Harden says that if he were not a Jew, the court would decide the case differently and would not acquit his near assassins. Harden also said in his speech that he could understand anti-Semitism, and yet he regretted that in Germany people did not realize that exactly what they ascribed to the Jews in Germany, people abroad ascribed to Germany, to the Germans. Shortly before his death, following a sympathetic article that Lessing published about Harden, Harden told him, quotation, "I am a fighter, and to what extent I am will emerge in a few weeks as die Zukunft will appear again, which is nowadays more important to Germany than ever before." Quote ends. The story of Maximilian Harden, thus, according to Lessing, illustrates the fate of a self-hating Jew who admits his Judaism to himself and to the public only when forced to do so by the pressure of hostile surroundings. But once such pressure diminished, he reverts to being a self-hating Jew. Thank you for your attention.
We'll take some questions. Professor Amsel, would you like to? I'm putting you on the spot, perhaps, but Professor Amsel is a professor here at Columbia in psychology.
Thank you. Thank you for that paper. Thank you for that wonderful paper. The question I had is that when we look back at assimilated Jews in Germany, it's from a historical perspective, it seems obvious to us what the temptations were, right? The temptations were to try to assimilate, to try to leave Judaism and be part of this larger cultural society. Yet it seems to me that in the U.S. today there are parallels and disparallels. In some ways there is no such parallel because we live in a postmodern society, at least among the intellectual elite. We live in a society which is multicultural and supposedly participation in the goods of the larger society don't require abandoning your roots. And yet, right, within the institutions we see so many Jews who find themselves identifying with BDS and with anti-Israel, and it seems so clear to some of us that that is the same, deriving from the same need to participate in a kind of an elite.
Yes.
So I wonder if that, first of all, I have two questions for you. First, did my question make sense? And secondly, if it did, could you answer it?
Yes, I agree with you. You know, I had this experience in Germany. So I was living many years in Germany, more than 7 years, and you know, you don't have to identify yourself with Judaism, right? So the surrounding will do, and then you know it's a pressure on you to do something to identify yourself with the surrounding. So very often people tend to take the extremist pole in the society. For example, the BDS, right? I'm not sure that this story is correct. But one of the Red Army terrorists in Germany, Horst Mahler, who he started as a lawyer who represented these terrorists. And then he became, it turned out that he himself is a terrorist, and he went to jail. And after 17 years or something like that, he went out of jail. And recently, 3 years ago, he was sent again to jail. He's now 73 or 74, I don't know why, because he for 10 years or something like that, because statements that he made on the Holocaust and so on, bad statement. And he said that I'm a Jew, I'm Jewish. Do you know? So here you have, an example of somebody that that takes this pressure from the surrounding. Maybe it's projected, as Lessing says. Maybe it's completely subjective. Maybe it doesn't exist. But it's as Lessing says, it's a neurotic disease. So he takes this imagined or real or both pressure, and this is what we get. So,
thank you. And also, just as a point of information, Adam Katz 2 weeks ago gave a talk for us, ISGAP at Harvard, and he spoke about how Jews are bound up in the creation of universalistic movements and yet maintain their own identity. So yes. Larry, this sort of postmodern moment, we're also encouraged to abandon our fixed identities. There is pressure to become the new Jew or the new American or the new
yes.
elite.
Yes.
So Adam Katz, it's a very interesting article.
Yeah, I was just reading the day Austria declared war on Serbia. Freud had, this is the greatest thing that ever happened. I feel like a man. The Austrian-Hungary, the empire, the dual monarchy, is finally stepping up, being, real. It's not passive. It's not that he's being aggressive, and that's what he felt that a certain kind of malehood was about. And I think there's an element of self-hating, anti-Semitism. It eliminates a certain passive, feminine mentality of a Jew. I can be that tough guy. Bring it to to hating yourself. The picture of the Cossack with the mustache and the saber who hates the Jew. In other words, you're bonding with that kind of image out of the weakness. So it is compensatory, and in that case, I think Freud showed, whether he wanted to or not, his reaction was partially coming from that kind of world.
Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a question about your discussion of Lessing's influence, Nietzsche's influence on Lessing, and specifically this principle of
yes.
amor fati,
yes.
to love one's destiny, one's
yes.
fate. How did he deal with what seems like a tension between that principle on one hand and Zionism on the other hand, which would be a kind of fundamental transformation of one's fate?
Yes. Thank you very much. So I hope that I got you, but if not, so please correct me. He says two apparently contradicting things. So there is the amor fati, the love of your destiny, and he sees in this destiny. Okay, so it's your destiny to be a Jew. So don't try to avoid it. Don't try to escape it. Be a Jew, even if it means the worst life on the earth. So this is your destiny, right? But on the other hand, so your destiny is something that comes from outside, right? It's like the destiny of the cripples or the invalids in Zarathustra, right? So they have to affirm their destiny. They have to affirm to accept their destiny, their life, right? So likewise, the Jews should accept their lives. It's not clear whether he talks here about their life in Israel, in Palestine, or in Europe as minority. But it's clear that please, no assimilation here. Assimilation is the opposite, right? Assimilation means not to accept your destiny, not to accept your lot in life, and then you end your life as Maximilian Harden did, right? So he was enforced to admit that he is Jewish. Yes, after people tried to assassinate him. On the other hand, there is a thing of this projection. So why destiny, right? So he's talking about projection. Self-hatred and anti-Semitism is something that has nothing to do with transcendental destiny, but rather with inner subjective projection. So I'm not sure that I got you, but.
Well, I think that, it seems that the Zionism from the context of
yes.
Germany in the 1930s would
Yes.
pride in one's Jewishness, but actually it's actually a kind of transformation of sort of Jewish history. It's less. It seems to be less of a passive acceptance of destiny and a kind of active movement towards something new, something else.
No. So I don't think so, because you can see because and this is something that I try to say in the beginning of my paper. So there was a stream of Zionism that saw in Palestine the solution to this assimilation and inferiority and so on. But there was another stream. Like you see, a very famous German author who wrote in this time, Karl Kraus, very, very famous, and he thought, on the contrary, that Zionism is the best example of self-hating Jews, because Zionism means that assimilation failed. But he thought that assimilation, namely cultural, physical, and so all aspects of assimilation is possible. So when you come up with the idea of Zionism, it means that assimilation failed. So you see here two streams. So one is what Theodor Lessings thought, that Zionism, that there is no assimilation is simply impossible, right? So you must accept, or if you live not in Palestine, so or among hostile surroundings, you should accept your destiny. But it's not necessarily so, because now there is a settlement in Jewish settlement in Palestine. This is only one stream. But on the other hand, you see other streams, and there was a huge debate about that between these two streams of thought, of people that thought that no, there is no chance for the settlement in Palestine, and it only means that assimilation failed. But in fact, assimilation can be successful and leads to better life for the Jews. So, thanks. Yes, please.
We see that there's a historical continuum when it comes to the question of Jewish self-hatred.
Yes.
The assimilationists were always in search of certain specific political and social advantages. And today we find that most of the self-hating Jews are those who seek or anticipate specific benefits. So
yes.
Why do we consider that a psychological issue when it's just a purely human greed, issue of greed?
Thank you. It's a very, very interesting, question. So, what Lessing would say is that okay, so it's a human. It's in the human nature to try to better their life, and assimilation is one option. But in the case of the Jews, it's simply impossible. So assimilation can be only on the surface. So only on the surface, deep inside of the person, assimilation is impossible, and it leads to neurotic disease, or to as it is in the case of Maximilian Harden. So he was sure that he's no longer a Jew, and he was a German patriot, and so on and so on. But he was called a dirty Jew one day. People started calling him dirty Jew because he supported the Treaty of Versailles, and then he was assassinated. So this is the point of Lessing. Yes, so you are right. So maybe it's the best way to do. The best way to do when you live as a minority is to assimilate, right? But he says, okay, so maybe, but not in the case of the Jews. With the Jews, it simply doesn't work. So I'm not sure that he is right, but this is what he would.
I was just saying that
yes.
The neurosis is caused by the self-hatred.
Yes.
The neurosis doesn't cause the self-hatred.
Mm-hmm.
It is the self-hatred that causes
yes.
the neurosis.
Yes.
Because the anticipated advantages of assimilation never come
Yes.
Because there is never any successful assimilation.
Yes. Yes. So I agree. Thank you.
So if I can follow up a little bit, you were saying, to what extent is Lessing influenced by kind of the racist thinking of the time? Because in a sense, you're talking about people believed in the innate nature of different racial groups.
Very good question.
It sounds
Yes.
like Lessing is sort of emulating the philosophy of the moment.
Yes. Of course. So he started. First of all, he was very good friends with Ludwig Klages, who was is a very famous Nazi philosopher, and he believed in race and all these mythologies of German superiority and so on. So he was a very good friends with Ludwig Klages, of course, and he was part of the youth movement in Germany. That, of course, that the Nazis took over many things from them and so on and so on. But then, and he also converted to Christianity. And one day, somebody told him, "Be careful! You're not a real Christian. So you are a Jew." And then he was attacked. And then he converted back to he reverted to Judaism, and he became a Zionist. So he thought that this is the only solution maybe for the Jews. But of course, he was heavily influenced by all these philosophers or ideologists of race. Yes, it wasn't.
And they believe you can't escape your.
Yes. Yes, and this is something that we can also see in the later Lessing when he talks about Jewish destiny. You cannot evade your Jewishness. Thanks, Charles.
Any other comments or questions? So I have another question, if I may.
Okay.
Is there anybody else? Because I don't want to take up too much. Can you you mentioned Hannah Arendt in passing. I know it's not central to the paper, but her relationship with Heidegger.
Yes.
And you mentioned Shalom's letter to.
Yes.
He accused her of being self-hating.
Yes.
Could you speak a bit about Hannah Arendt's Jewish identity and sort of being connected to a Nazi thinker and what her connection to Israel and self-hatred in your view is?
I think that thanks. It's a very good question. So it's complicated. So I think that my cousin Jay, who sits here, so he told me that these people didn't suffer from self-hating, but rather they were in love with themselves. And I think that in the case of Hannah Arendt is a clear example of this. So she, as I brought a quotation of Rathenau who talks about the Jews. He himself was Jewish. Who talks about the Jews as Asian mob in Germany. So this is exactly the language that Hannah Arendt used in order to portray the Jews in Israel. So there is a correspondence between her and Karl Jaspers from during the Eichmann trial. And she refers to the Jews in Israel in the worst terms, and of course she wanted. So she was a typical person with this ambition to assimilate, to be better than the Germans. So for example, she hid always the fact that her grandma and grandpa didn't speak German properly, but rather German with a very, very heavy Russian accent. And so you see, she's an example of that. But her correspondence with Karl Jaspers and the references that she make to the Jews in Israel as mob, as this is really it's the worst anti-Semite would not say the same.
So to follow up, so now in the sort of postmodern moment,
yes,
where we're not supposed to be in our fixed nationalistic Zionist identities, here in this in the elite institutions in the West. Hannah Arendt has become sort of a celebrity
Yes.
in the academy, in the canon.
Yes.
How does this relate to contemporary notions of self-hatred among the elite?
Yes.
And sort of in this moment where Israel finds itself geopolitically, the whole question of and the American Jewish community.
It's a very good question. So, and I think that it is related to the first question. I forgot your name. Larry. Yes. Thanks. Sorry. You know, so she, I don't know, but you know, she wrote her first book was on Rachel Farnhagen. And she had a literary salon in Hamburg, I think, or in Berlin, with all the famous people who came there, all sorts and so on. And she was Jewish, and she says, I hate my Jewish blood, and so on and so on. So I hate my Jewish blood. I feel ashamed to be Jew, and so on and so on. And so this is the first book of Hannah Arendt. She wrote on Rachel Farnhagen, but the book is very personal. You know, it's not a real academic book, but I think that Hannah Arendt had some or felt herself or had a deep sympathy with Rachel Farnhagen, and I think that it is the same. It is maybe it goes to what Larry said. To this direction, that you know that she tried to adopted the extremist pole of the society, or the extremist attitude toward Judaism, towards the ghetto, and so on and so on. And you see it in her book on Eichmann in Jerusalem. So the way that she talks about the Jews. So I'm not talking about now about the correspondence from during the trial, but in the book itself. So she calls Rabbi Leo Beck the Jewish Führer, and she also sometimes she uses a very, very rude language in order to refer to the Jews, for example, to Katzetnik, who testified about his suffering in Auschwitz, and so on and so on. So this is what I think. Yes, and I'm sorry. Just one more remark on that. So I'm sorry. So just one more thing. I think that there is a very, very good essay by Walter Laqueur on the Arendt's cult, about the cult around Arendt. So it's a wonderful essay. But I think that one of the, and this is also from my own experience in Germany. So she was and she's the most popular thinker in Germany. There is a train route, which is called after Hannah Arendt. She's really the most popular because she, as a Jew, she can say what other people think, but cannot say because then they would tag it anti-Semite. So when it comes from a Jewish pen or from a Jewish mouth, so it's okay, so it's fine. So we didn't say nothing. We just saw like that. But here we go. So we have here a Jewish author who voices anti-Semitic or harsh critique of the Jews, etc. Yes, please.
Yes, I was going to ask if the growth, you can ascribe the growth in self-hatred among American Jews to the fact that less and less of the younger generation are really being given a real study of Jewish history. Because I've spoken to many university students, college students, graduate students. I didn't find one who could give me the real definition of Zionism. It has become such a negative word when in fact people don't even know what it actually means or what the movement actually involves. Is this reduction in Jewish education among the young contributing to the lack of knowledge and then leading to the self-hatred of more and more American Jews? It's a good question,
and I don't know, but as Larry said, so here there is no pressure. There is no pressure as there is in Europe on the Jews, as far as I know. I recall my first visit to the United States. I came from Germany after 2 years there, and I was a visiting scholar at Pittsburgh, and it was during the second Iraq War, and so I felt there. So everywhere, harsh critique of the United States and Israel, and of the bond between the United States and Israel, but I never felt anti-Semitism directed to me as I felt in Europe. So I think that here people don't have the same pressure as they did or as they do in Europe. So it simply I think, but I'm not sure. I don't know. So it may be just process marriage with people who are not Jewish, lack of education, as you said, surrounding or society which doesn't put pressure on you because you're Jewish, and so it's a natural it's a natural process of mixing in society. But I don't know. I'm not sure. Yes, Larry, please.
Hello. I don't believe that in Eichmann in Jerusalem, Hannah Arendt ever refers to the Israelis as simply Jews. She refers to them as Israelis, the national identity of a young state.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, reasonable people can disagree. Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg
Mm-hmm.
made a very clear statement on the protests surrounding the opera, the death of Klinghausen.
Mm-hmm.
Well, would you consider her self-hating, anti-Semitic? Reasonable people can disagree, even within the tribe.
Mm-hmm.
Second, another historical figure, some contemporaneous with Hannah Arendt, who enjoyed extraordinary power,
Mm-hmm.
was Margherita Sarfatti,
Mm-hmm.
who was left her husband and children and position. The husband was a banker, very successful,
Mm-hmm.
and was Mussolini's consort, slept with him for 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
and was a principal architect of culture under the regime.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How would you compare her with Hannah Arendt? Hannah Arendt left Germany, fled to France, worked in refugee aid,
Mm-hmm.
came to the United States. No, she wasn't a white-hot Zionist, but there were factions, there were differences, there was no unity necessarily within the Jewish community. So, was Scarfetti self-hating? Why is Hannah Arendt self-hating when, there's nothing in there are no curses, there are no slanders, there are no,
Mm-hmm.
it's an academic, it's a high-quality study.
Mm-hmm.
Just some thoughts for you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sarfatti had a salon in Rome. Ezra Pound spouting his filth of that anti-Semitism there. She was also playing the violin, at Einstein's bed when he had a cold day. I mean, it really is both sides. You really can't, and I'm sure you can make the same statements about Hannah Arendt too. I'm not so sure that the conversation that went on in those smoke-filled, rooms up in Westchester or New Rochelle where she's living we're always kind to the Jews, or in effect we're always, pointed. People get out there, and you're not responsible for the person's comments, or are you? I don't know, to be honest. If you invite Ezra Pound to a soiree, you're going to expect to hear a lot of garbage that's going to offend you. I think there's a responsibility. Columbia University's invited people here, and there's been a big discussion about that. Should that person be allowed to be here, and so that this kind of spouting goes on? I don't know. That's a real tough one.
I think that yes, yeah.
You mentioned Karl Kraus.
Yes.
Condemning Zionism as a true form of Jewish self-hatred.
Yes.
Precisely because the assertion of Zionism
yes.
that Jews should properly assert their identity uniquely
yes.
And distinctively among other peoples in
yes.
the world would be a denial of what I guess Karl Kraus took to be the proper fate of
yes.
Jews, which would be to transcend their particular.
Yes, exactly.
And perhaps that theme should be explored. That is, there's a dichotomy
yes.
between those Jews who see their proper fate in
yes.
transcending and leaving behind
yes.
The primitive
yes.
tribal association
yes.
with Jews and Judaism, and going on to a larger
yes.
whole, and those Jews who see their proper fate that they should embrace as in realizing whatever good they can accomplish through embracing
yes.
a relationship with their heritage and people.
Yes. It's a very good point, and thank you that because I just only by passing mentioned Karl Kraus. Yeah, so this was one of the side of the argument about the state of Israel and about Judaism, whether the settlement in Palestine is an example of self-hatred, or rather overcoming self-hatred, and so on. So Karl Kraus, I think he wrote very bad things. For example, about Herzl, right? That Herzl, because he wants to establish a state in Palestine, so he's the best example. He's the best example of self-hating Jew, and not only that. So this would lead to a huge wave of anti-Semitism. So the state, or the idea of the state of Israel would necessarily lead to a huge wave of anti-Semitism, because the Jews, as you said, claim now their peculiarity instead of get assimilated.
But excuse me, don't you think we are giving credibility to quack philosophers when we talk about those who expected the Jews to transcend their tribal
yes.
identity? Because history teaches us that those who tried it in Spain were not spared. In France, the laws, the État des Juifs, the laws of 1943 in France, they did not spare the Jews who for 3 generations had already transcended their primal Jewish affiliation into the greater society. So when we even take critics of Zionism, who say the Jews should have transcended, when these people are not supported by the course of history, they have no standing to make the argument. Because those who actually tried their approach were still persecuted. Generations after their families had transcended their tribal instincts.
I think thank you. I think it's a very good point that you are now making. I think that okay. So but again, so Lessing would reply. I think that okay, so assimilation may seem to be a good solution, but it simply doesn't work. So you see that after second generation of assimilated Jews, such as Maximilian Harden, they are called dirty Jews, and they and get assassinated.
So also, if I could to follow up on this point, which I think is very important.
Yes.
So, as you were speaking now, and also, I think we have to put into context the context in which this philosophy is emerging, and so the antisemitism and the hatred of the other in general. So, as you were speaking, I was thinking of Emmanuel Levinas and sort of the ethics of recognizing and seeing the other, and how this is the foundation for a just society.
Yes.
And in the philosophy that we were discussing here, there's a tendency to blame the victim and to focus on the victim.
Yes.
So how about the ethics and the perception of the other and the treatment of the other and the capacity for European philosophy and society to really, truly, with humility, not with tolerance, but with humility, accept difference? I think that's where the spotlight has to go, not simply on the problem of the other and how they integrate or not integrate, if they're effective, not, and sort of putting the blame on the victim of this barbarism.
Yes, it's a very interesting point, and I think that it's a very interesting point, and I think that we talked about it when we met at the first time about the book by Alain Finkielkraut about the Klaus Barbie trial. They said, okay, so now we need to accept the others here. So they put people from they put on Barbie trial people who just from different countries who fled to France just in order to give chance to other people to try Klaus Barbie, and it turned out that he did nothing wrong or nothing worse than what people in Cambodia and Vietnam and other countries in the world are doing. So actually, he's not he's man of his time. He did nothing wrong. So all the case and nothing. He did nothing worse than what Israel is doing in Palestine. So nothing. So actually, so he did nothing wrong. So this is it's a very important point. So of course, Levinas has this ethics of the other, of the face of the other visage, and so on. But you see also a negative aspect that this theories can lead to. For example, when the German court said, I recall 4 or 5 years ago, that they cannot try a man who killed his wife out of honor killing because it's simply his culture, So this is a bad example of this. Accept everything that is different.
That's not Levinas. This may be
that's not Levinas, but this is what other people.
Civil servants in Germany.
Yes. Yes, Larry.
Assimilation has been successful in North America.
Could you use the microphone?
Assimilation, can you hear me?
Yes.
Assimilation appears to have been successful in North America, in the United States. Maybe less successful in Europe, although there are significant examples of men and women of the Jewish faith who rose to the highest ranks of power and influence in their society. Even Prime Minister of Great Britain, Disraeli. So there seems to be a very sharp definition of what failure and success maybe we didn't say to the second power,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of critique.
Mm-hmm.
And we know clearly that there was a profound fissure in
Mm-hmm.
Zionism between the revisionist Zionist faction
Mm-hmm.
and the labor social democratic faction.
Mm-hmm.
And they were not friendly disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
So you can extend the definition of self-hatred and anti-Semitism to include someone like Hannah Arendt,
Mm-hmm.
but you're taking a lot of liberty.
Yes. I think that so this is what Yaakov said, that these people were in love with themselves, and it's very clear in Hannah Arendt. She was really snob. It wasn't self-hating. So she just looked down at the Jews, and she was she was just looking down at the Jews. So yesterday I was at Brown, and historian Omer Bartov said, yes, of course, she was Yeke. This is how Yekes look at other Jews, namely Yekes, Jews of German origin. And then he added, but all originally came from Galicia. But Elchanan Yakira showed me a book recently about Hannah Arendt, that a new book that by her niece. I can't remember her name, and she says that Hannah Arendt always felt wonderfully in Israel among the Yekes in Rehavia in Jerusalem. Because other people who were in love with themselves and saw that all the rest are primitive Jews, mob, etc. So this is what.
What's the difference between that perspective and the Ashkenazi elite and the Jews from Arab countries who settled in Israel and experienced discrimination, perceived discrimination, class discrimination, tend to ignore the class structure of both Israel and the diaspora?
So it's not the Ashkenazi Jews, because Ashkenazi Jews refer also to what she terms Ostjuden or calls Ostjuden. In her correspondence from the time of the trial with Karl Jaspers, you see her writing, for example, about Hausner, that he's from Galicia. He's not a real German. He doesn't speak a real. He's not a real German. His German is not like of the German. And then she talks highly of Judge Landau, because he was a real German. He studied in Germany law. So you see this snobism in Hannah Arendt, and of course she talks very negatively about the Ostjuden, or the Ashkenazis who are not from Germany. So
I want to say something provocative.
Okay, right.
Is it so shocking that Jewish intellectuals hated themselves? They had just been enfranchised.
Mm-hmm.
They were oppressed for centuries
Mm-hmm.
in this land.
Yes.
They were just being integrated, first generation, going to universities. And to succeed in a culture
Mm-hmm.
that was on the verge of exterminating the
Yes.
Jews.
Yes.
Is it any wonder that those who were trying to go through the halls of power and success hated the culture that was despised to the core for centuries? That's number one. And number two, going back to some of the issues here about Jewish self-hatred and the inability of young American Jews
Mm-hmm.
to defend their own selves in so many ways. I just came from a meeting this afternoon with leaders of the Jewish community.
Mm-hmm.
Senator Menendez was there. Leaders of the Obama administration who are in
Yes.
charge of sanctions were there. Senator Lieberman were there, and the leadership of the American Jewish community. In 3 weeks,
Yes.
the centrifuges in Iran are spinning, And the deadline is in 3 weeks. This is a regime that openly is set out to exterminate, to destroy Israel, and to kill Jews. This is the core part of their political ideology,
yes,
the theology.
agenda.
And let me just, to finish, the canon in this university, Edward Said, postmodernity, frowns upon the Jewish notion of self-determination, of Zionism. The Secretary of State is running around the world blaming Israel for jihadism and the peace process in the Middle East. The correlation between apartheid and Zionism by this administration has been consistently, through mistakes and overhearing conversations, but it's in the discourse.
Yes.
This is not 1933. This is not Germany, but there are very serious issues, and I would say pressures on the American Jewish community to kind of walk this tightrope. And I think in the General Assembly, when Obama praised the second in command of the Muslim Brotherhood to the General Assembly, praising him. Now, this is a movement that calls for the Muslims to finish the work of Hitler. And the President of the United States, the most powerful country in the free world, endorsed the second command, the Sheikh from Qatar, in the General Assembly in front of the world. And we were, the intellectuals, the Jewish community, the human rights community in this country are silent. So I don't think it's any wonder that scholars in the Ivy Leagues and the media of record, and especially the youth, are, this is a very important moment historically in this country. So it's not Europe. The anti-Semitism here is different, but it's here. And I think our community is, our intellectual community and the Jewish community is struggling with there's stuff in the discourse, and there's an elephant in the room.
Yes.
I just want to continue on the same line. Somebody talked about the assimilation having been well done in North America. I would like to remind that person that in fact the Jews were paid to go to Spain. They were taken to Spain, they were paid actually to go to Spain to bring civilization to Spain. And so they were well assimilated, they had all kinds of, they were not assimilated, but they were given all kinds of powers and all kinds of privileges in Spain. Eventually, there was the Inquisition. And when we talk about Germany, it was a country in Europe that provided the best opportunities for Jews for a very long time. Whereas Jews couldn't own property, they couldn't practice the professions in other countries in Europe. Germany was the first country that actually gave economic and professional opportunities to Jews. But eventually, they were the Nazis. So the idea of assimilation ever being a success is an illusion. It might be that in North America there is not that intensity yet of anti-Semitism. In the 17th century, you couldn't say that about anti-Semitism in Germany or in the 18th century. It was latterly that it started gradually, culminating 100 years later with the Nazis. So I don't believe in assimilation. If a society cannot tolerate its components for who they are, that society is a dangerous society. And we are seeing it now, the growth of anti-Semitism in the universities in America is at the same level as in Europe. But people shouldn't be fooling themselves. I go around universities in this country, and the growth of anti-Semitism in American universities, where even Jewish students' organizations are even stopped from having their own meetings. It is daily. It is everywhere. Ivy League, junior colleges, community colleges, everywhere. And if people don't wake up to that reality, we pretend that we have congressmen and all the Senate that support the cause of Israel. But I have yet to hear one congressman or one senator stand up and condemn Qatar for its contribution. Qatar is the greatest enemy of Israel today because it is the principal sponsor of both Hezbollah and Hamas. Not one senator of the 100 who pretend to be supporters of Israel has stood up to say anything about the United States taking action to stop Qatar from sponsoring Hamas, from sponsoring terrorism against Israel. Not one, not even Schumer.
I'm not sure, but I have just one question.
Okay.
That is a part of my research. I want to ask you if you think that the self-hatred of Jewish can be compared with what Jean-Paul Sartre described in the question of Jewish. As okay, there is a part of assimilation, but there is a self-hatred of Jewish that Jean-Paul Sartre defined like inauthenticity, the Jewish of le Juif non authentique. Do you think that Selig was the same person? Can be involved in this definition?
Thanks for the question. So I don't have vividly his text in my mind now on anti-Semitism, but I think that he's also that he's also talking about projection, about subjective projection. So there is nothing in the Jew as such that justifies anti-Semitism. It is a projection of the society upon on the Jew, something which is similar to what we saw in Theodor Lessings. But I'm not sure. I do not have this text vividly in my mind now. So.
It's okay if you don't have the text, but it's the second part of the text. The last part of the text. The first part of the text discusses about what is anti-Semitism, how the Europeans are deeply in their nature anti-Semite. Now the last part tries to describe a Jewish who want to fly away from, let's say, Europeans anti-Semite, but create themselves a kind of anti-Semite. Because they say, I never belong to this population. I don't belong to Jewish population. I am a Western man. I'm a person, let's say, European or white, I don't know. But at the same time, they are flying away from the community. So Jean-Paul Sartre said that only an inauthentic Jewish can refuse to help his community, to fly away from a community. That is, I didn't know if the person you were describing enter in this kind of definition. Let's say, I give one example. I give one example.
Okay.
Sometimes I heard from Eastgate members that people here in America they are not aware of antisemitism. So some people don't want to work with people who are fighting anti-Semite because they don't want to be, as a Jewish, they don't want to be considered like a part of this kind of Jews who are defining their life against. Do you think that Selig was like one of this kind of Jews who denies his own community, who was not involved in combating anti-Semitism?
I think I can explain this.
Okay, yes, please. Thanks. Okay.
Jean-Paul Sartre. The problem Jean-Paul Sartre was confronting was that they were the anti-Semites who were detrimental and dangerous to the Jewish community. But they were also the inauthentic Jews who were also dangerous to the community because they were incapable of joining the fight against anti-Semitism. So to him, to Jean-Paul Sartre, the anti-Semite was just as bad as the Jew who tried to flee from his people, to abandon his people in the struggle against anti-Semitism. That was...
okay, so I hope that I got you. Thanks. Thank you both. I think that so in this book of Theodor Lessings, there are 6 biographies, And you see there among the people whose biographies he includes in this book, there are people who were the head of the spear of anti-Semitism, of Jewish origin, were the head of the spear of anti-Semitism in Germany. For example, Otto Weininger, who wrote this book, So it was a very, very beloved book by Hitler and the Nazis. Arthur Trebitsch, he's also there. He was a really active anti-Semite and in the anti-Semitic movement. All of them are of Jewish origin. So we talked about Maximilian Harden, who was not that active, but still was very influential. Person in the German scene before the First World War and between the war, and he published a very intellectual, respectful magazine, The Future, Die Zukunft, and he published there lots of anti-Semitic articles and statements. And as we read here, a statement by, or a quotation from Rathenau, who was also of Jewish origin, against the Jews, and so on and so on. So you see, from the examples of Lessings where he stands.
So a couple comments on things I've been hearing. As far as Hannah Arendt is concerned, I'm a trauma psychiatrist. I work with people who've been traumatized. If anyone were to suggest that any of the victims, for example, of rape or people who had their parents murdered, who I treat, if anyone was ever to suggest or to use the phraseology that those who committed those crimes were banal, anybody were to say that, then not only would the victims of this trauma be outraged, but the entire academy right now, with its sensitivity, would be outraged at characterizing the victimizers as merely banal. To me, Hannah Arendt's phrase and her argument, therefore, represent an emotional denial of the Holocaust. It's an emotional denial of the Holocaust. It is a lessening of the crime. Its goal is a lessening and reducing of the crime, and it's an emotional denial of the Holocaust, which is nothing less than disgusting. Point one. Point two, what's happened in America, and I was raised Orthodox, and I left Orthodoxy, and my savior, the Messiah, was the American Academy, and it was my Messiah. Got into Columbia, Yale. This was the American Messiah, the new Jerusalem on the hill. It was a wonderful place, and it actually was. And over the last 20 years, what I have watched is the decrepitude of this through the works of Chomsky and Said and all of these kinds of people who have turned the American Academy into an Israel-hating and an America-hating distortion of itself. And currently, the price to pay for being accepted within the artistic or academic elite in America is denial of your brotherhood and sisterhood with those Israelis who are our brothers and sisters. That's the price. And that's no different a price than you had to pay in Spain by being a converso, or no different than the price that you had to pay in Germany in the 1920s by completely abandoning your identity. So yes, outside of the elite academies and the artistic elite of America, assimilation is going rather well. But within those elites, and these elites, by the way, are becoming the political elites as well, within those elites, we are back to a 1920s style. Abandon your Judaism in the form of discredit and disavow your connection to Israel if you want to be an accepted Jew. I hope that's not overwrought.
Thanks, I agree. I agree, and so with Hannah Arendt, of course. So I wrote in my book, there is a chapter on what she means by banal. So why she doesn't call. I wrote in my book, there is a chapter on the banality of evil of Hannah Arendt. I agree with what you were saying, and I asked why she calls Eichmann banal and not a person who sacrificed his life in order to rescue Jews, right? So so why Eichmann did, and it's clear from recent studies that he wasn't banal, that he wasn't normal, but so there is a wonderful book by Bettina Stangnet. I don't think that there is yet an English translation. It's relatively new, 2012 or 2006. Bettina Stangnet.
What language?
German. Yes, and you see that he was not banal, and he was not that he wasn't just a cog in the wheel that follow orders and so on and so on. That he improvised a lot in order to increase the number of the murdered Jews, and etc. 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 So I agree with that. Regarding your second point, that we are back in the anti-Semitism of the 19th century, I had the chance in the spring to talk with. There was a huge debate in Europe around the circumcision, whether to prohibit circumcision in Europe, in Germany, and in Scandinavia, and so on and so on. And it was a huge debate, and I had the chance to talk about that with John Efron. He's a historian in Berkeley, and he told me that it's only apparently a medical issue and a law issue and so on and so on. All the prejudices against the Jews, the most prejudices against the Jews, are in the background of this discussion. So, and he also gave examples and so on and so on. So he said that I don't buy these stories that it's only a medical issue and a law issue and so on and so on. All this old school anti-Semitism is in the background of this discussion. So,
excuse me. In 1973, I was at the University of Heidelberg. I was doing my research at the University of Heidelberg. Mm-hmm. And I had a distinct privilege of meeting Albert Speer. He had just been released.
Yes.
And he was living in the Schloss.
Yeah, no.
And the district attorney of Heidelberg was a family friend, and he arranged for me to interview him. And the first thing he did was quote Jewish philosophers, German Jewish philosophers that had justified the anti-Semitism that developed in Germany. And in fact, he reminded me that the first people who were opposed to the Eastern Jews who were migrating, running away from the Holocaust that was already in Eastern Europe. Mm-hmm. He quoted the president of the Jewish organization in Germany, who condemned you, who didn't want those filthy Jews to be admitted into Germany.
Yes. Thanks. Yes, so I'm not surprised to hear that this is what Albert Speer said. So it's only natural that it's only natural. It's only how to say makes his case stronger. And so on. So he was also he knew what to say in different contexts. So yes.
I was wondering if you can just respond to three examples that I think might be call into question some of the Lessings framework of Jewish self-hatred. Mm-hmm. The first would be Max Nordau, mm-hmm. who's a famous early Zionist, mm-hmm. who was also very influenced by Nietzsche, but had this notion of, mm-hmm. Sort of the new Jew and rejection of certain elements of the mm-hmm. Jewish past, which he finding are associated with humanist and so on. But I think it would be a stretch to call him a self-hating Jew. The other example is Franz Rosenzweig, who famously was at the point of converting to Christianity and sort of in this mold of the classic sort of Jewish German assimilationists, and then had a kind of epiphany and returned to his Jewish roots and Jewish particularism, but never embraced the Zionist version of that. And the third example, I guess, would be that some of the conflict between within Israel between religious Jews, the Haredim, and secular Jews. I mean, I think you would point to certain examples of for instance, like this former Shinui party, with the way that they speak about the Haredim in Israel sound very similar to these kinds of attacks on the Osti.
Yes, good example. I'm not familiar with the work of by Max Nordau, so I read things, but I'm not familiar with him. With Rosenzweig, a little bit. So regarding what is going on in Israel. So of course, this is an example of So they some Haredi communities for example, they disrespect the Day of Independence in Israel, or they don't stand in the Memorial Day of the Holocaust and things like that. And they also say that, okay, why we don't do that? Because you are not real Jews, yes, and vice versa. So the secular Jews say, okay, so you are not real Jews because you disrespect, or you don't celebrate the Day of Independence. You don't respect the Memorial Day of the Holocaust. There is always, there was a delegation from Israel, from Neturei Karta, to the Holocaust Festival in Iran. So so this is one. There's that Ahmadinejad organizer. So this is another example of how they see things, and it's a good example. So thanks.
So on that note, so we're running out of time. So Alon, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Very rich. Thank you. So thank you for coming. I was at a lecture yesterday. Somebody said this is not church or synagogue. If anybody wants to move up to the front, you're very welcome. You're welcome if you want. Okay, feel free. So I'm going to be. You ready? Okay. So today we are fortunate to have a brilliant younger scholar, Alon Segev, who's here. He teaches continental philosophy at the University of Illinois. He received his doctorate degree from Haifa University in Israel, which was followed by numerous grants, fellowships and grants, teaching positions, including the Lady Davis grant, which I had a couple of decades ago at the Hebrew University. He was a postdoc at the Hebrew University from 2002 to 2003. He was the Max Planck Menerev grant and teaching and research position at Heidelberg University. He was there from 2003 to 2008, and he was a visiting professor at Stanford and at Pittsburgh University. Alon Segev has published extensively on various topics, including ancient and modern philosophy. He's presented papers literally around the United States and internationally. His recent book, which is how I found out about Alon, is Thinking and Killing, Philosophical Discourse in the Shadow of the Third Reich, which was published by De Grunter in Berlin and in New York in 2013. And it was selected by Knowledge Unlatched for its pilot package of books and it's also available as an ebook. The book deals with the contributions of 8 German thinkers to the Holocaust, and the later discussion it provoked. It contains translations of 2 important texts by Carl Schmitt and Ernst Junger, which were previously unknown to the English language. And I'll just say what's crucial about this issue. I think we often have the assumption that the university and scholarship and the educated are somehow the remedy to issues of anti-Semitism and racism and inequality. But if we look critically at how knowledge is produced and who produces it, we can see that often, unfortunately, the fact is that the university and our thinkers that our societies produce are actually at the forefront at times to unpleasant and even barbaric actions. So I think this is a very important sort of looking at the underpinnings, the philosophical and even civilizational underpinnings to anti-Semitism and various forms of racism. Alon is currently researching the ideological background to the student movement in Germany, particularly as it concerns the Holocaust and contemporary attitudes to Israel. He gave a seminar on this topic to the advanced students of Hebrew University. He has a new book in preparation on the political readings of Descartes in the 20th century. Today's topic, Theodor Lessings, Jewish self-hatred, is the topic. In 1931, Theodor Lessings visited Palestine and was amazed that he could find a copy of his book, The Jewish Self-Hatred, which was sold in Jerusalem, and that he was recognized while visiting the Western Wall. Among the admiring readers of Lessings' book was Gershon Scholem and Max Brod, 2 important Jewish thinkers from Germany. Today his work is completely forgotten, and Lessing would not be recognized by anyone at the Wall these days. Lessing coined and introduced into the discourse on anti-Semitism the term Jewish self-hatred. His book on the topic marked his personal turn from self-hatred to Zionism. And unfortunately, perhaps, it's a timely issue. So, Alon, thank you for being here, and we welcome you to our seminar.
Jewish self-hatred long ago became a label attached by Jews of one political stance to Jews of other political stand. Thus, for example, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu called Rami Emanuel and David Axelrod self-hatred Jews. In recent decades, the question of Jewish self-hatred was very often being raised and discussed following suggestion and accusation made by Jews in Israel and abroad that Israel is responsible for at least part of the Palestinian suffering and misery. Lately, the question of Jewish self-hatred has been often raised in relation to the BDS movement, which draws support from Israelis and Jews abroad. The distinction between self-critique and self-hatred seems to be unproblematic and clear on the level of the common sense. But once we try to tackle it on a higher level, we find it difficult to draw clear lines distinguishing self-critique, self-hatred, Jewish self-hatred, and anti-Semitism. Descending from that higher level, we see the peril in automatically dubbing any criticism leveled at Israel's politic as an expression of self-hatred. Most important, as can be inferred from Shulamit Volkov's description of Theodor Lessings' negative attitude toward the Ostjuden, not all expression of Jewish self-hatred by Jews implies self-hatred. A Jewish person does not have to identify himself with the Jewish people or nation. Thus, in hating Jews, he does not necessarily hate himself. The criticism, quotation by Shulamit Volkov, the criticism of Eastern European Jewry by people like Lessing was not self-hatred in this milieu. It was a critique from the outside, from a position of aloofness and distance. Quote ends. The meaning of a given term is contingent upon coherent use and implementation in a circumscribed context. The difficulties implicit in the term Jewish self-hatred emerge once we attempt to implement it. For example, Rachel Farnhagen, Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of the social milieu and literary salon, culture into which she apparently fit, but deep inside she felt her Jewish origin barred her from belonging there. Otto Weininger's Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of his theory, which
Yes, good evening, and thank you, Charles, for the invitation, and it's a great honor for me
to be here and for organizing this wonderful event. And I also wanted to thank Marion for all the organization, and thank you for coming. Yes, so Theodor Lessing, as Charles said, he introduced into the into the political and historical discourse the term Jewish self-hatred. He wrote a book about that. It was very popular among Zionists, and then completely forgotten. Sorry? Back in 1931, when Theodor Lessing visited Palestine and was amazed that he could find a copy of his book, Jewish Self-Hatred, sold in Jerusalem, and that he was recognized and called by name by strangers while visiting the Wailing Wall. Among the admiring readers of Lessing's book were Gershom Scholem and Max Brod. Today his book is completely forgotten, and Lessing would definitely not be recognized by anyone at the wall. Lessing coined and introduced into the discourse on anti-Semitism the term Jewish self-hatred. His book on the topic marked his personal turn from self-hatred to Zionism. In this book, Lessing analyzed the phenomenon he tagged Jewish self-hatred and offered a cure. His method was psychoanalysis, and his attitude towards the Jewish question was Nietzschean. The present paper starts with critically analyzing Lessing's text, showing his debt to Nietzsche, Freud, and Husserl. It concludes with Lessing's discussion of Maximilian Harden, a converted Jew in whom Lessing saw an illustrative example of self-hating Jew. The term Jewish self-hatred was coined and introduced into academic and political discourse by Theodor Lessing in 1930. Although, as has been demonstrated by Sander Gilman, we can relate the term back many centuries to expressions and writing by converted Jews regarding non-converted Jews. Trace the Jews as feminine and lacking a personal center. For Weininger, women also lacked such a personal center, but contrary to the Jew, they could find it in their husbands. Likewise, Karl Marx's Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of the critique of capitalism, according to which, as he developed on the Jewish question, Judaism is the idea of capitalism and egoism, an idea that reached its full realization under Christians and within Christian state. Quite differently, Karl Kraus and Anton Kuh, Jewish self-hatred should be discussed in the context of the Zionist movement that began in the late 19th century. Sander Gilman, in his broad study, Jewish Self-Hatred, which focused on anti-Semitism and Jewish self-hatred in German-speaking zones in Europe from the 12th century to the period after the Holocaust, suggested language as a key to understanding Jewish self-hatred. Thus, any occurrence of anti-Semitism and Jewish self-hatred should be traced back to the peculiar language spoken by Jews or to the relation between different spoken language or jargons. Hebrew is conceived as a secret language of witchery and corruption that molds and forms the personality of the Jew, and then Yiddish is conceived as an inferior German dialect spoken by inferior humans. Hence, both were also apt to serve sieves as means to surreptitiously communicate. Gilman's framework may enable us to map different expressions of anti-Judaism voiced by Jews, but the ambition to trace all these expressions to language or to the relation between different languages turned out to be an unjustified theoretical projection, and thus the outcome may look far-fetched. Rachel Farnhagen talked about the shame, sham, of being a Jew as the core of her resentment toward herself. Likewise, Yaakov Wasserman talks about shame as the essence of his Jewish self-hatred. Notice that Farnhagen was born into an Orthodox family, and Yiddish was her first language, whereas Wasserman was born into an entirely assimilated family, and German was his first language. Their shame consisted of various components and cannot be explained away by reducing it to language. Moreover, in the case of Fritz Mautner, who was probably